Why, hello, everyone out there in internet land. It is me, Jeremy Vaeni, and I sat down here to do yet another little YouTube video. I was going to address something other than what I'm going to talk about now, because, lo and behold, I thought I was out of Kundalini questions, and Joe UFO had yet another video response with more clarification needs. So cool, that gives me something else to do. And Joe, in the beginning of his video, goes through all of the stuff on his desk. And first of all, Joe, the communion bust, that's impressive. Yoda, yes, check. I'm glad you clarified that it wasn't the Enterprise TV show. But I know that in the back of your mind, you were fighting the urge to say, not the inferior Enterprise, gentlemen, but the original movies. So I'm glad you didn't say that, because I might not address any of your concerns if you had said that. But what was really startling was not just how much Jeremy Vaeni memorabilia you own. You don't really own memorabilia, but that you just glanced over Twin Peaks. Because the Twin Peaks box set, that's kind of monumental. Anyway, so it seems as though your question is maybe twofold. One, how is Kundalini energy really just us in an internal phenomena if a slit opened in my spine and something external poured in and I poured out with it? And then two, is it possible that it sort of trickles alive as opposed to one big baboon? Or not to be confused with a baboon, because nobody wants a big baboon inside them. Anyway, unless... never mind. The first part of that I was actually trying to clarify by talking about the slit opening and the energy pouring in and me pouring out. The point of that was, and now that I have a little, I can back off my own babble a minute to make this more clear, I think, is that it's all you, right? I mean, from the ultimate perspective, there is the thing that is reality is nothingness / thingness, right? So there's nothingness, which really is another word for intelligence. And what is that intelligence doing? It is manifesting all things. So, and the reason that I say nothingness is another word for intelligence is, in the book, of course, I do this neat little trick where you say, okay, well, if you take away all things, what are you left with? You're left with nothing. So if we say that there was nothing to begin with, well, what is nothing? Nothing is a concept. Concepts exist in intelligence. This concept exists prior to the brain. Therefore, this is intelligence outside of the brain. So it's sort of like giving a stupid little proof of intelligence seemingly prior to matter, prior to the brain and prior to all matter, all things. But it's really prior to and inclusive of, because there isn't just a formless intelligence floating around. It is doing something. What is it doing? Being. What is it being? Everything. So if you take it from that large perspective, then all of this is you. You and me are the same. We're the same thing. This microphone is the same thing. Everything is one energy manifesting as different things. Now, that's fine in theory. We can all hold that in our heads in theory, or as a belief system. You can hold it as a belief system and go, yeah, and hold it as an ideal outside of yourself to go, okay, I'm going to strive to live up to the standards of that, and I'm going to respect nature, and I'm going to love thy neighbor, and all this. That's one way, and that's the predominant way to approach this. The other way is to realize what that actually is saying, which is, no, you are that. I am you. We are one. Not we are connected in oneness, but we are, in fact, one. And so what that really, when you really get that, then you become that perspective. That oneness becomes you, right? And so when that oneness becomes you, there's no need for traveling. So prior to the experience of a slit opening up and energy pouring in and me pouring out, if it were possible, and I don't know that it is, but if it were possible, that I was that I amness, that I was alive in that way, I would not experience traveling. I would not experience a slit opening up. I would not experience me leaving. Because the moment that I left, like I said, and wake up, it's like you realize you're going non-local, essentially is what it is. Right now I'm localized in my, me more so in my brain, Teokusin probably more in his heart, but in my body. You see what I'm saying? Like, we're all localized somewhere in here. But when in the I am state, you are non-local. You're all places at once. And one of those places is back in your body. And again, that's even doing it, an injustice to say all places at once, because all places are once. So it's still breaking up into things on some level, into separations on some level. But I think you get what I'm saying here. So if I were open to that non-locality, if that were my identity as self, that non-local spirit, then there would be no traveling. So the traveling is an illusion, and that's what the meaning of illusion is when these spiritual people talk about, illusion and that sort of. That's an example of that type of spiritual illusion between here and there, traveling, this and that. It's not just between objects and people, it's also within yourself. The this and that becomes the Kundalini and the person. So that's one thing. And then, so it's not an internal, external, is what I'm saying. We break it up that way. And the enlightenment is coming out of the state of seeing it that way and experiencing it that way. God, I'm doing much better at this now than I was the last video, aren't I? Must have been the coffee. Why do I have to drink coffee to get smart and hyper intelligent? Oh, wait. So that's one thing. But then the other is, so we are that energy. We are that, but we block it out, or the brain blocks it out with this persona, with this other I am that it projects into the world, for the reasons that I stated in the last video. And one question sort of is why does it have to be this way? Well, because it does. I mean, that's just the way it works. It's like I put in that video a little, a little screen saying, "Ma, why do I have to eat my broccoli?" It's like, well, yeah, because we do live in a world of separate sense selves and identities and things and objects and physicality. We live in that world of separate physicality. We live in a world of time. Because why? Because what is non-being or non-physical intelligence, what is it doing, right? We said it is manifesting through being. It's being and therefore manifesting. Well, what's it manifesting? All things. What does that mean? It means that it's breaking up, in a sense, it's one vast tapestry of imagination, if you want to call it that, into objects, because it's creating something, right? It can't create more of itself. It can't create more nothing. Nothing can't beget nothing. So when in being, it is creating what? It is creating something. And once you have something, you have time. And once you have time, you've got us. Well, you don't really necessarily have us, but in this instance you do. However, you don't have to be that person who is mentally, spiritually, however you want to put it, trapped in time. Because the thing that's of time is the physicality, is the body. Right? So the brain is a creature of time. The brain is trapped here in the physical world, going through the motions of time. But the natural state, or the other natural state of you, is the nothingness, is the timeless now, is that moment, right? So the brain wakes up into time. The brain projects a time-based self. How does the brain not project that time-based self, and what happens? Well, by achieving silence, which is essentially nothingness. And then what happens? You become that. It's not that the brain achieves a separate thing called nothingness. It's that the brain basically gets that it's not going to be able to get it through a separate thing. It's not going to be able to understand this awakening or whatever by drawing in in creating a separate object, an idea or a something, a belief to itself. Once the brain gets that, really gets that, that's the end of the self, because the self is the thing searching for this, right? So the self dissolves and nothingness becomes you. Nothingness becomes the entity of the vessel, as it were. So now your two true natures are being represented fully. Now you've got thingness, which is the physicality, the body, the brain, the whatever, that's here, and the nothingness, which is flowing through and informing as the true self. So, in a sense, or maybe in all of full sense, what we're saying here is, when you say that Kundalini is really just another word for your true face, your true self, and not some energy that pops up and does magic, what we're really admitting is that Kundalini, as we treat it now, is an unconscious impulse, right? It's the unconscious you. And so what has to die is the ego, which is the conscious you, the self being projected out, right? And we all know from just basic psychology that the conscious self is a shallow puppet. Like even psychologists say this, that what's really controlling you, as if there's a you separate from the controller. So that's a falsehood. But let's just keep it simple and say the real you is this unconscious mind, and it informs and instructs, and in fact it acts a millionth of a second before you consciously interpret, if that makes sense. That's like the latest research. As of, I don't know, a few years ago, I remember reading that the unconscious mind, like a millionth of a second, knows what's going on before you do. And so if you'll remember, there was the Paratopia episode where I had seen that weird light on Jeff's ceiling that he had been talking about. And it was like the moment, I decided to really regard it and say something is when it winked out. And it's like, so my question then was, is this phenomena working on a level of the unconscious where it's actually not engaging me consciously, it's engaging the unconscious. So it knows my impulse before I do and is reacting to that. And that's why it's always like one step ahead. So just, I guess if you want to think of it in paranormal terms, you can think of it that way. But in any event, the point is that Kundalini is you, and it is unconscious. And if it's not being born out, when the self is negated. So can you experience it in trickles? Yeah, I think we do. I think we do every day. And I think that psychic ability, like you talked about, is something different, is another sort of toy in the toy box of things that most of us don't use that can come alive when we are fully alive, in when the unconscious comes consciously clear. But even as I'm saying this, there's still the difference even between that and the slit opening and the seeming energy pouring in. In other words, I think that, like, where I am now in my life, as you know, I think, is that this Kundalini, that me, that I am alive in that way, that I can shut off Mr. Personality here for 1/1,000,000th of a second, and this thing will come alive and start doing its exercises and whatever. And even as I talk about it, you'll notice I'm saying it and me, because I don't know, it's just easier. Again, maybe this is where I need Lakota language. It's just easier for me to break it up that way in my thinking. But maybe I'm doing a disservice to myself, because maybe that is the thing keeping me from realizing the non-local oneness that I also am. Because as I'd said before, and as I wrote in the book, that was an experience with the option to buy. And I didn't buy into it. I decided to come back and do YouTube videos for whatever stupid reason. But what happens when even that is always open? So that slit or whatever, that we recognize ourselves as that chain of being, or that's, sort of string of consciousness. And I guess let's go back to the finger puppet analogy. You've got your fingers. You've got finger puppets. Imagine a finger puppet. The finger puppet is the ego. It's what the tip of your finger is projecting to explore this world out here. More real than that is the finger, which is projecting it. More real than that is somewhere down here is this what we perceive as this Kundalini that rises, right? But it's always rising. It's just that we don't experience it fully consciously. So it's always being blocked somewhere along the way. But even more impressive than that is there's a slit that opens up. And that's when you are connected all the way through from the great hand of oneness, all the way through to finger puppet. The hand of oneness is what projects the finger puppet now, not the brain, because none of this is cut off. And so you see then, once you're at this point, that there was no slit. There was no Kundalini. There were just blockages, if that, you know what I mean? There were just things cutting off because we're physical creatures living in a physical world, blocking off all the time. That's what we do. That's what the brain does in fear. In a certain sense, you could say that's the natural state of physicality, is to do that. So why do we do it? Well, it's nature, baby. But once you get here, you realize not just this for you, but all these fingers are the hand. And so once you're in that state, you know, that's the big experience. I didn't buy into as a stage to live on as myself, because I was afraid. You know, do you just become discombobulated and crazy? Like, what is that? Could I relate to you? Could I relate to anyone around my family? Like, how do you hold down a job? But in thinking about it later, this is where I think I might have screwed up, which is that when you're in hand mode, you realize you're still here because there was no travel. This traveling was an illusion. You're here, you're here, you're here, you're here, you're here, you're everywhere, you're all of it. And so can you sort of localize at will? Is that what sort of free will becomes? The ability to focus in such a way that I am me for the allotted time that I wish, and then can recess back into the full, you know, so that I could relate to people around me, but then actually live in this larger state of being. And I think, yes, not just in that, not just in figuring out the locality versus non-locality thing, but also if I just look at, my state now of being awakened to Kundalini. I can turn that on and off at will. And sometimes it likes to come alive and do its own things at its own time. But even that I could not have happen if I want. So if I bubble out from that, could I live in that ultimate state and be able to, like a faucet, sort of turn that on and off at will, and know everything as oneness, but also as separate self, in the same way that nothingness understands itself as nothingness and as itself, if that makes sense. So essentially, I think all of this coming alive is basically joining the two, the thing that we break up into two different aspects, the nothingness and the thingness. It's joining those two. And in the same way that you say, well, how do you see that nothingness is the intelligence, prior to all things? Well, because it's a concept, blah, blah, blah. You have to strip away all things to get to that notion, right? You strip away all things, and nothingness is the case. And we're saying the exact same thing here, because this is the holographic universe at work. We're saying you strip away all things, which is you, which is, first you've got to strip away the notion that there is a you separate from your thoughts, a thinker separate from the thoughts, because there is not. There is this breakaway thought that believes it is the thinker. Once you get past that, once you deal with your own personal psychology, however you do that, is your own business, but then come to that, you're essentially getting rid of the things of mental clutter, right? And you're narrowing them down to the one thing, the thinker. Now I understand all of these thoughts are the thinker. And then getting rid of that. Of course, you don't have to go in that sequence. There's no sequence to it. I'm just, for the sake of this YouTube video, speaking of it this way. Point is, if I've gotten away from it, you're getting rid of the things of mind, of the mental clutter, to see, to understand, to experience, to be in nothingness, to therefore be that intelligence, that formless awareness that exists in the now, in the ever-present now. You're bringing that alive through the body into the time stream, and in a self-conscious way. The self-consciousness of that, of spirit, if that makes sense. Because that's what humans can do. So that's because that's what we are. But again, even as I'm talking about it, it seems like we're breaking it down into, I've got to die internally for this other greater thing, this God or whatever, spirit, to come through me. And that's not what it is. It's just this language is a barrier, and I was raised to speak English. So, and I know you were, because you're English. I hope you see what I'm getting at here, that there is no travel, there is no thing coming in and coming through. There is a barrier that we have set up. And from our point of view right now, there are these things, and there are these steps that you have to go through. And then once you go through them, you see that that was an illusion. Because once you go through them, then you're in the now moment, and you realize, oh, time and all of this is an illusion. Oh, we set it up this way. But this is where the word necessary comes in. You know, in the book I talk about it's a necessary illusion. And Ken Wilber, that's who I'm stealing that from, really. It's a necessary illusion, meaning it's going to occur. Why do I have to eat my broccoli? Because that's the way things are set up. That's what physicality is. This is what it takes to become healthy in the physical world. That's just the nature of physicality and time and separation, is that you have to, as an entity born into that, see through it to recognize that there's the illusion. So this is where I think, not just New Age people, but I think spiritual guru types throughout the ages have gotten it wrong by not recognizing that it is a necessary illusion. Because I think when you just say, well, it's all an illusion, that belittles what it actually is. Because you can say, this is an illusion, this table, but I'm knocking on it. It's solid. It's there. And so is it an illusion? Well, from that big ass perspective of, you know, one energy manifesting, you know, imagination, sure, it's an illusion. And not only that, it's inhabited with spirit. It is alive. It is alive in the same way that you and I are alive. But we cannot experience that from this separate sense of self. So to just make that a belief system or to belittle reality and say, well, it's all just an illusion anyway, doesn't matter, because you still are living in it. You are of the illusion, whether you intellectually recognize it or not. You're still there. I'm still there. Okay, less me than you. But you get what I'm saying. It's a necessary illusion. It needs to exist because it's one of the rules of physics. Let's put it that way. It's a law of physicality. You've got time. You've got separation of objects. Therefore, you have illusion. You've got a self-aware sentience that exists in that. It is going to mimic what it sees originally. And then it's going to figure it out. Or it's going to be conked on the head and have a moment of nothingness and figure it out that way, however it works. But when it comes back and tries to interpret that experience for the tribe or the globe, if it doesn't say, oh, necessary illusion, then it has completely screwed everyone over for as long as it takes for the next person to open his or her mouth and more closely identify what reality is, what isness really means. So precision here is key, and it's hard to do in our language. It might be less hard to do in another language, but either way, language is always a barrier. It's just about shutting up and being silent. And that's when I stare into the camera and let it fade out on that note so that you have something to take with you, with you, with you. God, I'm deep.